American conservatism. It is often oversimplified and misunderstood, not only by foreign spectators and non-conservative Americans, but even by American conservatives themselves. The United States is a massive country whose politics are divided by the two-party system into the factions of the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. These, of course, are just political parties, parties whose ideologies have changed over the course of their existence to now stand for conservatism and liberalism respectively. But these are broad titles. The broad entities of American conservatism and liberalism are themselves made up of multiple more clearly defined factions. And in this video we will be breaking down the factions of American conservatism along with our pal Carson Wolf, who will be tackling the other half of this video over on his channel. We'll begin with the factions of mainstream conservatives. Factions of the right which are characterized by a widespread and prominent holding of public offices and domination of right media and narratives, thus having a large and direct influence over the national agenda of the right wing. The first of these factions are the old right are a faction of conservatives who owe their beginnings to a blending of old Republican laissez-faire economics with the old Democrat belief in the authority or rights of the states, and Reagan-esque Christian, often evangelical Protestant values. As you might imagine, this faction emphasizes fiscal conservatism, small government, and general decentralization, opting for a federal government which empowers state governments to pursue conservative legislation at the local level. The old right will often hesitate to take initiative on bold new policies that might be received poorly by the public, generally following the philosophy of pursuing policy wanted by the people rather than needed by the people, making them, relatively speaking, a very democratic faction of conservatism and one which favors order and procedure even at the expense of tangible political outcomes. A consequence of all this, however, is that the old right demonstrates significant restraint in their approach to federal policy, to the point that old right politicians in federal positions are often characterized as ineffective, pandering, slow to act, or easily persuaded. Compromise with the opposition party is far more welcome by them than by other factions across both parties, and this willingness to compromise paired with their perceived ineffectiveness has led many old right politicians to be labeled as rhinos or Republicans in name only. Some key figures of this faction include Mike Pence, Lindsey Graham, and Mitch McConnell. Paleoconservatives or paleocons, unlike members of the old right, are far more statist, more ideologically driven, and generally more conservative on social and economic policies. Paleoconservatism is rooted in a belief in natural law and hierarchy, a deeper sense of nationalism, and a willingness to use government power to push forward a definitively conservative agenda, though still generally at the state level. American paleoconservatism typically draws upon later Jeffersonian and early Jacksonian era policy, which favored sovereignty of the states but placed a greater emphasis upon the role of the executive over the legislative branch, as many in the old right do, finding their base of power in federal and state legislatures, while paleocons opt for roles of more executive authority so as to push forward more sweeping changes. When it comes to federal policy, paleoconservatives do rally together and push forward policy on matters pertaining to law and order, border security, and civil well-being, feeling the need to take action when American quality of life is at risk. This comes on account of a deeper sense of identity with America as a people, whereas the old right generally upholds America as a system or ideal. The old right being more willing to act when it's felt that American institutions are at risk. Key figures of the Paleocon faction include Ron DeSantis, Marsha Blackburn, and Tucker Carlson, as well as organizations like Turning Point USA. Neoconservatives or neocons owe their beginning to the Cold War era. This period of American history saw a hard shift away from the historic domestic focus of the country to one of interventionist foreign policy. Like neoliberals, who constitute the other half of what some have called the Uniparty, neocons are defined by a pro-globalist policy, unrelenting support for free trade, military interventionism in foreign countries in the name of spreading or protecting democracy, support for the military-industrial complex which facilitates these interventions, cooperation with foreign organizations and interests which further facilitate globalization, and an oftentimes warped view of American exceptionalism that demands a sharing of American prosperity with the world. Domestic policy is what differentiates neocons from neolibs, in that neocons will push for fiscally and socially conservative domestic policies, but are more than willing to compromise on domestic policy to gain support in foreign proposals. Because of this weak-handed approach to domestic social issues, as well as the cross-party influence of this interventionist faction, the neocons have become a haven for liberal subverters intent on undermining the larger conservative faction by pushing its Overton window to the left. Understandably, this faction is rife with politicians often regarded by other conservatives as rhinos. Noteworthy figures of the neocon faction include George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Dan Crenshaw. The New Right, as the name would suggest, is a relatively new faction of the conservative movement. It is made up of generally late millennial-aged Americans inspired by the bold presidency of Donald Trump and who are now running for high offices themselves. Like Paleoconservatives who came before them, the New Right stresses nationalism, paternalism, and traditionalism. However, what separates them from Paleoconservatives is their strong emphasis on the traditional culture and ethics of America based in old Northeastern Anglo and Christian principles. This faction draws upon early Federalist beliefs in natural hierarchy, strong central authority, and a deeply moral, orderly, and responsible society, as well as drawing upon the ideological contributions of later pro-centralization Catholic immigrants, creating a broadly pro-authority, pro-order, pro-tradition, and pro-Christian conservative movement. The New Right is also far more pragmatic in its approach to economics, not shying away from ideals considered progressive or left-leaning by other factions. The New Right views economics as a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. That end being to ensure a higher quality of life for the average American family through policies that encourage and support traditional roles, lifestyles, and communities. Noteworthy figures within the New Right faction include Blake Masters, Josh Hawley, and Joe Kent. Though often regarded as a third and separate faction to the duality of Democrats and Republicans, most libertarians generally do share socially conservative values in regard to self-sufficiency, personal responsibility, and natural hierarchy, albeit tempered by a heavy dependence upon ideology, a tolerance of generally liberal positions, and a general dissatisfaction with collective identity. Rooted in a distrust of government typically based in dissatisfaction with the ineffective bureaucracy of modern democratic republican systems, as well as the deceptive and unscrupulous actions of many modern politicians, libertarians are an inherently anti-establishment faction that seeks to decentralize government power and entrust it to private entities and individuals to do with it as they see fit, working off the premise that private self-interested entities will naturally feel more deeply invested in doing what's for their own good, and that this success and competition will radiate out to the benefit of the rest of society. Libertarians are of the live and let live mentality, removing social issues from the realm of national policy and leaving lifestyle choices from education to drug use up to the individual. However, given the highly ideological and idealist nature of libertarianism, the general apathy toward directly addressing social issues, opposition to the very structure of the political order, and greater emphasis on individual over group identity, this faction often finds great difficulty pushing forward major political policy and building a larger support base. Some key figures of the libertarian faction include Ron Paul, Rand Paul, and Larry Elder. American Conservatism. It's much more than just a coverall term, and it's a lot more than what you see in the government buildings of DC. American conservatism includes factions that, although not visibly represented in government, do have a clear presence within its ideological zeitgeist, impacting and shaping conservative American culture, or in some cases, just barely hanging on to its fringes. You can find part 2 of this video along with a lot more political and social content over on Carson's channel in the video card here and in the link below. The US of Z thanks you for watching, support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z,